I tear your thread.
When you mention the X-Men, most people immediately think of Professor X, Wolverine, Magneto, Storm, and so on. But very rarely will you see someone pick the character I'm going to talk about in today's video. Like many office settings, the tech guy is often overlooked. And that metaphor perfectly applies here. Except this particular tech guy builds incredible gadgets and can seemingly rebuild almost anything that's broken. But if you still haven't figured out who I'm talking about, allow me to tell you. In today's spotlight, we've got none other than Forge. Without wasting any more of your time with this build-up, let me jump straight into the character anatomy of Forge and explain what his strange, brilliant mind caused throughout the decades of X-Men stories. That being said, let's begin. What is Forge's mutation actually doing inside his brain? Alright Forge, let's study the mutation inside your brain first. It's unconventional because instead of giving him spectacular physical strength or the ability to fire energy blasts, this mutation affects his cognitive abilities. Forge possesses a superhuman intuitive talent for invention. It functions almost like a sixth sense, allowing him to understand machinery, mechanical systems, and technological possibilities instinctively. With this inherent advantage, even someone who's mastered engineering through years of conventional learning falls short. Look at you, Tony Stark. Theory and logic can only take you so far. Forge's subconscious mind handles many of the complicated steps that another inventor would have to work through consciously. One particularly fascinating aspect of this ability is that he can visually perceive what has been described as mechanical energy, including the kinetic and potential energy operating within mechanical systems. That's an insane bragging point. Because of this ability, he can understand how a device functions, recognize its potential applications, and determine how it might be repaired, modified, or rebuilt. Now, back to this fascinating brain of his. Whenever Forge encounters a mechanical problem, his mind can instinctively diagnose it and begin developing a solution. Keep in mind, I'm not declaring him smarter than anyone else or directly comparing his intelligence with Reed Richards, Victor Von Doom, or Tony Stark. Forge's ability works differently. When most people solve a technical problem, they consciously work through a series of theories, calculations, and logical steps. Forge's subconscious mind performs many of these steps automatically. The strange consequence is that Forge doesn't always fully understand his own inventions after building. On some occasions, he's had to disassemble one of his creations to work out exactly how it functions. So yeah, his cognitive ability is the foundation for everything that follows in his life. And trust me when I tell you there's a lot that makes his life an eventful one to narrate. How did Forge use the souls of his dead soldiers to open a portal to another dimension? Now here's a niche part of the video. Comic nerds like me will know exactly what I'm talking about. But if you don't, it's nothing to worry about. Just listen carefully. This story takes place before Forge became an X-Man, and long before he began working as one of Mutant Kind's most important technicians. Before all that, he was a soldier in the Vietnam War. But to understand what happened there, we have to go back even further. Born into the Cheyenne Nation, Forge was trained from childhood in mysticism by an older shaman named Nas. His people believed that Forge might become the warrior capable of confronting their ancient enemy, the demonic trickster known as the Adversary. Forge, however, decided to forge his own path. No pun intended. He rejected the life of a shaman and enlisted in the United States Army. During his second tour of duty in Vietnam, his entire platoon was killed in a surprise attack by enemy forces. Consumed by rage and grief, Forge returned to the mystical training he had abandoned. He used the spirits of his 9 fallen comrades as part of a forbidden ritual that opened a portal to a demonic dimension. A horde of demons poured through the opening and destroyed the opposing soldiers. But Forge quickly realized that he had unleashed something he couldn't control. The ritual had also allowed the adversary to gain a foothold in the human world. Forge attempted to stop the catastrophe by calling a B-52 airstrike on his own position. The bombing closed the portal and destroyed the demonic forces, but Forge paid an enormous physical price. He lost his right hand and his right leg in the explosion. So there are a few important things to take away from this event. First, Forge's mystical abilities are not part of his mutation. They came from years of shamanic training. Second, the rage and trauma caused by the deaths of his comrades drove him to use magic he had previously abandoned. And third, although the bombing closed the portal, the consequences of the ritual were not completely erased. The adversary had gained access to Earth, and Forge would spend years dealing with the results of that single decision. Why did banishing the adversary not actually get rid of him? After unleashing the demons, Forge used the airstrike to close the portal and drive the adversary back. But the original ritual had already given the demon a foothold in the mortal world. Years passed, and Forge attempted to leave his mystical past behind. He became a government inventor and focused almost entirely on technology. Unfortunately, his past eventually returned to haunt him. The Dire Wraiths, an alien race of shapeshifters, were secretly attempting to invade Earth. One of them murdered Nas and absorbed his form and memories. The false Nas then fell under the influence of the adversary and became part of the demon's plan against Forge and the X-Men. The imposter manipulated Storm into believing that Forge had been corrupted and was trying to destroy the world. In reality, Forge was attempting to close another dimensional portal. Storm attacked and stabbed him before discovering the truth. Forge and Storm then fell through the portal and became trapped in another dimension. The adversary had successfully removed the two people he considered the greatest threats to his plan. This brings us back to Forge's actions in Vietnam. He'd not created the adversary, who was already an ancient enemy of his people, but his ritual gave the demon an opportunity to establish itself on Earth. Forge had closed the door, but he hadn't prevented the adversary from eventually finding another way through, and that led to one of the most devastating storylines in X-Men history. Why did 9 mutants sacrifice their lives to stop the adversary? Now that we're here, let me explain why this phase was considered so devastating. During the fall of the mutants storyline, the adversary unleashed chaos in Dallas. Reality itself began breaking down around Forge's Eagle Plaza headquarters, with different periods of history colliding as the demon attempted to destroy and reshape the world. The X-Men and the government-backed Freedom Force became involved, while the battle was broadcast on national television for millions of people to watch. Meanwhile, Forge and Storm had been imprisoned by the adversary. They eventually escaped and rejoined the conflict. Despite the enormous force gathered against him, the heroes could not defeat the adversary through conventional attacks. He was simply too powerful. There was, however, one way to banish him. Forge had to cast a spell that mirrored the ritual he'd performed in Vietnam, but this time the spell required 9 willing souls. 9 individuals voluntarily sacrificed themselves. Wolverine, Storm, Colossus, Longshot, Rogue, Dazzler, Psylocke, Havoc, and Madeline Pryor. Forge then cast the spell. The 9 volunteers were transformed into beings of pure energy, which Forge gathered together and hurled at the adversary. The attack forced the demon through a mystical gateway known as the Great Gate, which closed behind him. It worked. The adversary was banished, but Forge believed he had killed his friends to accomplish it. Overwhelmed by guilt, he withdrew into seclusion. However, Roma, the guardian of the dimensions, had used her powers to resurrect the X-Men and Madeline Pryor. Interestingly, Roma also explained that the adversary could not remain imprisoned forever, because the chaos he created could sometimes lead to change and growth. Nevertheless, Forge still had to live with the knowledge that he had been willing to sacrifice 9 people to correct the consequences of his own past. That's a heavy burden for any character, especially one who's often dismissed as simply the X-Men's supporting technician. Was Forge ever possessed by the same demon he originally summoned? Now this was a real curveball. Imagine possessing a mind like Forge's. He can design and construct technology that almost no one else can even understand. So naturally, his mind would be an extremely dangerous weapon in the wrong hands. And at one point, the adversary possessed Forge. The same demon that Forge had allowed into the world during the Vietnam War eventually took control of him. Under the adversary's influence, Forge's ability to create was turned towards destruction. This possession didn't last forever though. Forge's X-Force teammates, including Dr. Nemesis, fought to free him. Dr. Nemesis entered Forge's mind and the team managed to remove the adversary from it. The demon was then trapped inside a mental prison, buried within Dr. Nemesis' subconscious. There is something strangely appropriate about that. A fragment of Forge's greatest mistake had lived inside his mind before being imprisoned inside someone else's. Talk about never being able to outrun your past. Forge always seems to have another demon to deal with, sometimes metaphorically and sometimes quite literally. How did Forge lose his hand and leg, and what does that say about his physical vulnerability? Forge may have plenty of powers and abilities to boast about, especially ones that very few of his teammates can match. However, unlike many other mutants, Forge does not possess enhanced durability or healing factor. Physically, his body can be injured much like that of an ordinary person. During the Vietnam incident, when Forge called in the B-52 bombing, he suffered catastrophic injury. He lost his right leg above the knee and his right hand. He was also left with extensive scarring across the right side of his body. This physical vulnerability highlights a key aspect of his character. Forge possesses a mind capable of opening portals, constructing impossible machines, and developing technology that could change the balance of power across the planet. But his body remains vulnerable. That contrast makes him feel more human. He's neither a god nor an immortal. His mutation doesn't automatically protect him from bullets, explosions, or physical trauma. After losing his limbs, however, Forge used his abilities to create cybernetic replacements. That is a testament to his genius. And it does make you wonder whether invention became more than simply a talent for Forge. Perhaps building and repairing things became his way of dealing with the parts of himself that had been physically and emotionally broken. How did Forge's cybernetic hand and leg become his most personal inventions? This is one of the details that makes Forge's character so much more interesting. After losing his limbs, he uses mutant abilities to design and build cybernetic replacements for himself. Forge's prosthetic hand and leg restored his mobility and could also contain concealed devices and weapons. Does that make Forge a cyborg of sorts? Technically, yes, and that's a key element of his physical anatomy. He became part biological and part self-engineered technology. restoring the missing parts of his body through his own invention. Of all the achievements Forge could brag about during his time with the X-Men, very few are more personal than rebuilding himself. His prosthetics show us exactly who he is without requiring a lengthy explanation. When something is broken, Forge builds a solution. Interestingly, later in the comics, Forge appears to have restored his right hand to an organic state. He still uses a prosthetic right leg, but the hand he had once lost is now flesh and blood again. His body therefore reflects multiple stages of his life: the injuries caused by his mystical past, the cybernetic replacements created through his mutation, and the latter restoration of part of what he had lost. What was the weapon Forge built that stripped Storm's powers away? One of Forge's greatest sources of guilt came from the weapon that depowered Storm. The United States Department of Defense commissioned Forge to develop technology capable of neutralizing superhuman abilities during the dire Wraith invasion. The weapon was intended to help deal with the alien threat. However, government officials Henry Peter Gyrick and Valerie Cooper decided to test the prototype against Rogue, who had been framed for murder. Forge objected because the weapon was untested and dangerous. When Gyrick attempted to shoot Rogue with the neuralizer, Storm pushed her teammate out of the way and was struck instead. Her weather-controlling powers immediately disappeared. The incident demonstrated just how dangerous Forge's inventions could become when controlled by other people. He had built a device capable of interfering with the powers of superhuman beings, but the government used it against mutants despite his objection. When Storm eventually learned that Forge had created the weapon responsible for depowering her, it caused a major rupture in their relationship. Forge later improved the technology to use against the dire Wraiths, but he eventually destroyed the remaining neutralizers to prevent the government from misusing them again. Still, destroying the weapons couldn't erase his guilt or undo what happened to Storm. How did Forge's relationship with Storm become a casualty of his genius? One of the most memorable parts of Forge's history is his relationship with Storm. It reveals his emotional side and makes him much more sympathetic. However, their relationship was never smooth. After Storm was accidentally depowered by Forge's neutralizer, he rescued her from a river and brought her to his home in Dallas to recover. During this period, the two began developing romantic feelings for each other, but Storm did not initially know that Forge had created the weapon responsible for taking away her powers. When she discovered the truth, she felt betrayed and left it. Forge hadn't fired the weapon, and he'd opposed the government's decision to use it against Rogue. Nevertheless, he had built it, and Storm couldn't ignore his responsibility. The unresolved tension between them continued for years. Storm later returned to help Forge when the dire Wraiths attacked, but the damage had already been done. The adversary's false Nas later manipulated Storm into believing that Forge had been corrupted and was attempting to destroy Earth. She attacked him before discovering he was actually trying to close a demonic portal. The two then became trapped in another dimension where time moved differently. During their long period together, they reconciled and rekindled their romance. Forge also succeeded in restoring Storm's powers. Their relationship continued after they returned to Earth, but it remained complicated. Forge eventually proposed to Storm. However, he wanted her to leave the X-Men and build a life with him. Storm hesitated, and Forge withdrew the proposal before she could fully respond. That moment effectively ended their relationship. Their romance is therefore a perfect example of how Forge's brilliance and guilt constantly affect his personal life. The machine that brought them together was also the machine that made it nearly impossible for them to trust each other completely. Is there a real limit to what Forge can build, and can his mutation create almost anything? I've been quite the hype man for Forge and his building abilities, and I'm sure you're wondering about his limitations as well. A lot of character breakdowns suggest that Forge can visualize and construct almost any mechanical device he can imagine. He's created technology that can neutralize superhuman abilities, detect aliens and mutants, generate advanced holograms, enhance cybernetic systems, and even interact with dimensional or temporal technology. You get the idea. However, his abilities do have limitations. For starters, he can't simply build something out of thin air. He needs the necessary materials, equipment, and time. His mutant ability also doesn't mean that he automatically possesses infinite scientific knowledge. His subconscious mind can develop a mechanical solution, but Forge may not fully understand all the theoretical principles behind what he's built. That's why he is occasionally needed to dismantle his own inventions to understand how they function. His inventions could also have flaws, be misused, or create unintended consequences. The neuralizer is a perfect example. So when calculating Forge's true abilities, you can't ignore his potential. But potential's not the same as unlimited power. Forge can design extraordinary machines, but he's still restricted by the materials available, the problem he's attempting to solve, and the consequences he may fail to anticipate. How did Cable's telepathic intervention affect Forge's mind? While Forge's mental abilities compensate for the physical vulnerability of his body, he's also experienced serious psychological instability. His mind is constantly processing inventions, but it's also burdened by trauma and guilt. After Bishop attacked Forge during the Messiah Complex storyline, Forge suffered severe injuries, including serious head trauma. Bishop also stole several time travel devices that Forge had been reverse engineering. During his recovery, Forge became obsessively focused on recreating his missing research and strengthening the security around his home at Eagle Plaza. His mental condition continued deteriorating. He later became consumed by the threat of ghost boxes, interdimensional devices connected to a possible invasion from another reality. Forge was becoming so convinced that he was the only person capable of saving Earth that he was willing to risk the planet to prove himself right. Although he appeared to die during the destruction of his complex, Forge survived. Cable later found him and used his telepathic abilities to enter Forge's damaged mind. Cable presented Forge's psyche to him as an enormous broken machine. It was exactly the kind of problem Forge's mutation was designed to solve. For perhaps the first time in a long while, Forge could clearly perceive what was wrong. He approached the broken mental construct as he would approach any damaged piece of technology, identifying the faults and repairing them. By fixing the machine inside his mind, Forge restored his sanity. This is a fascinating piece of storytelling. Forge's powers originate in his mind, meaning psychological instability can interfere with his ability to function. But Cable found a way to use Forge's own mutation as a part of the recovery process. Forge couldn't simply think himself healthy. Cable had to create a mental framework that allowed his intuitive mechanical abilities to engage with the damage. Once his mind looked like a machine, Forge finally knew how to repair it.
Should have gone to the past.
How did X-Men 97 compress decades of this dark story into a modern retelling? Forge was introduced to a much larger modern audience through X-Men 97. The series took major elements of his comic book history and adapted them into his own continuity. Using the life-death storyline as the foundation for Forge's role was a fascinating choice because that story represents the emotional core of his character. It involves Forge facing the consequences of his own intellect, helping Storm after she loses her powers, and falling in love with the woman harmed by a weapon he created. In X-Men 97, Forge remains the guilt-ridden inventor familiar to comic readers. He takes responsibility for creating the technology used to depower Storm and attempts to help her regain what she lost. The show also brings in the Adversary, although this version of the demon and its connection to Forge differ from the much more extensive history found in the comics. Most importantly, the series does not portray Forge as a villain. He's a man trying to correct the consequences of his own work. He makes mistakes, becomes haunted by those mistakes, and falls in love with Storm while attempting to help her recover. Regardless of the creative liberties taken with Forge's journey, it's great to see a character with such a devoted following being introduced to mainstream audiences through X-Men 97. He is, was, and always will be much more than simply the tech guy of the X-Men. And the fact that the essence of the comic book character remains intact shows the creators understood what makes Forge compelling. And that's our video for today, the character anatomy of none other than Forge. He's a walking paradox. He possesses one of the most extraordinary minds in the Marvel Universe, but his body remains vulnerable to the same violence and injuries that would harm an ordinary person. He's a hero who's often been reduced to simply being called the X-Men's tech guy, even though his mind can achieve things most superheroes could only dream of. He can build, break, rebuild, and do it all again with astonishing ease. His cybernetic limbs and the story behind them may be the perfect summary of his character. When Forge was physically broken, he rebuilt himself. But while I've called him a hero, we can't ignore the fact that he's repeatedly needed saving as well. Losing parts of his body, rebuilding himself, experiencing a mental breakdown, loving a goddess, and accidentally unleashing a demon are only some of the major events in his career. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, drop a like, share it with your friends, and comment below with your favorite Forge moment. Until next time, take care and ciao!